but it's illegal under our Constitution. The American people never decided that they want this. And in fact, the American people are saying pretty loudly, we don't want this anymore. We don't want to pour money into all these different parts of the world. And I don't agree with you that we get more bang for our buck than we otherwise would. And you can't be both. You can't be a limited constitutional republic domestically and a global empire abroad.
Dave Smith just smashed neocon Konstantin Kisin with cold hard truth regarding the American empire, the empire building in general, how backward it is, how it never pays off for America, and how in many ways Trump was the repudiation of this mantra, this neocon mantra, still defending that in 2016. So let's get right into this. This is fiery and contentious. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
But here's what I was going to ask you, because we had that same reaction to Iraq in particular. But I also think the going to the other extreme and saying there is no situation when we have to go out, and particularly if you are America. And look, I know this is maybe an area we might disagree as well. You like it or not, America is a global empire. America's 5% of the world's population consumes 25% of the world's resources. That's why you guys are so prosperous. That's why you're doing as well as you are. It's why you get to have your way in all sorts of international debates and discussions and whatever. But that empire is maintained by sometimes getting the club out and going, you guys need to fall in line here. Is that a fair assessment?
I mean, I think it's to some degree a factual assessment. I mean, yes, America is an empire, and in order to be an empire, yeah, there has to be like a threat of violence that you're going to have to use at times. So I don't disagree with that, but I guess I would just say that, like, you know, if we're accepting that as the premise that, like, look, America is this empire, well, then it's like, I do think at a certain point, because I see so many conversations about democracy and the rule of law and all of this.
No, all that.
Well, I'm just saying, but that's my point.
I'm Russian. It's like realpolitik.
Well, that's the thing, which I think it almost leads you to accept. Look, the people of the United States of America never had a referendum on empire. We never decided that we wanted to be an empire. And in fact, I could argue that the peace candidate running for president almost always wins. I mean, like, it's almost always a huge advantage. You can go all the way back the last 100 years. And the Constitution, the law of the land, does not say that we're an empire. We're supposed to be a limited constitutional republic. And
yeah, that was squandered long ago, but Dave's right. Usually the peace candidate wins. Obama was perceived to be that way over John McCain. You know, Bush was perceived that way over Al Gore to some extent, and certainly Trump was perceived that way above Hillary Clinton. He stood there on stage and told Jeb Bush, you know, your brother's a disgrace. Iraq was a big fat lie. Weapons of mass destruction was a big fat lie. I have to also refute Konstantin Kisin saying that you guys have an empire and that's why you're so prosperous. No, it's because of ingenuity of Americans and entrepreneurialism and trade and economic output that's the case. And the world empire is actually the impediment to that. That is what encourages inflation that destroys our wealth and compounds the debt in the form of $38 trillion in debt now. And then you siphon $200 billion into Ukraine and $25 billion to Israel after October 7th. No, that's not what gains us prosperity. Trading with other countries gains us prosperity, and I think we should get back to that. Because I think Jefferson was right when he said in his first inaugural address, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, and entangling alliances with none should be the American creed. That's the proven prosperity creed, not empire building.
You can't be both. You can't be a limited constitutional republic domestically and a global empire abroad.
Why is that?
Because a government that is big enough to rule the whole world is also too big to be a limited government. It's too big to be a limited constitutional government. And in fact, it can't be limited. It needs to have emergency powers. It needs to be able to, as you just said, exert force anywhere around the world if someone's not acting the way you want to act. And so, to me, that's the whole essence of the game, is that it's like, if we're going to be an empire, we can't be a republic.
I see.
And so if you want to save the republic, we have to abandon empire.
I see. That is
absolutely true, and this spills into global and domestic affairs. It spills into encouraging the feds to expand the surveillance state in the name of empire building. That's why we got curtailments of civil liberties in the wake of the war on terror. We got the Patriot Act and the DHS and the TSA, and on and on and on. Regulatory apparatus that's criminal, you know, subjugating Americans, violating our civil liberties because of these schemes. So it's not just limited to what happens abroad. it comes back down to affect us in serious ways as Americans here.
It's an interesting perspective. I mean, I'm not sure that's necessarily true in terms of the size of government, because you could have a very significant military and foreign service and the apparatus of government for dealing with foreign conflict while leaving your citizens mostly alone. I think that's possible.
That's not very well founded in U.S. history. Let's just say that. From the Civil War to World War I to World War II, you got the Espionage Act in World War I to jail dissidents that disagreed with the war. In the Civil War, you had northern newspaper owners shut down by Lincoln, 300 of them, even though that they were in the North, just for being critical of Lincoln. This is not true. Over and over and over again, they smeared Charles Lindbergh because he didn't want to get into World War II. In Vietnam, look at what they did to anti-war dissidents. You were a communist. What if you don't support Ukraine now? You're just a Putin agent. If you don't support Israel and the Israel first mentality and give them as much money as they want, bomb Iran for them and back Netanyahu, you're an anti-Semite. You're guilty of blood libel. On and on and on again. This spurs on domestic policies that criminalize dissent and at worst violate civil liberties like the Patriot Act did.
Well, you got to tax them to pay for it at the very least.
Well, the thing is, this is what I was going to say, is you might need to tax them to pay for it, but think about what you lose when you cease being an empire. This is my point about 5%, 25% of the resources consumed, right? Like, are the American people really prepared for the consequences of not being an empire that dominates the world? Because you got to think, and this is kind of how the world works, and we do know this, America pulls back. That vacuum isn't going to stay there. We'd agree on that, right? Like Russia and China, or whoever else can, would fill that void. We see this in Africa, right? America pulled out of Africa. The Chinese, to a lesser extent the Russians, but the Chinese especially, are basically coming in and taking over. Nature abhors a vacuum. So that's always been my argument, and I'm keen to genuinely hear your perspective.
Well, on that, it wouldn't necessarily be Russia and China that fill that void, especially because they're generating their own BRICS alliance right now. They have their own spheres of influence in the East, building upon it with Brazil and, India, BRICS country, Syria, Iran. These BRICS countries together are not trying to maintain a hegemony, even though that we're not in a unipolar moment anymore. When's the last time China invaded a country? Not since I was born. They have 2 aircraft carriers, and we don't know that void wouldn't be filled with, European countries. That's what we're seeing with Ukraine. They want to still support Zelensky. So does Trump, by the way. But they seem to want to do that. I'm all for it. I would get all U.S. aid out from that regime in Ukraine. Trump doesn't want to do that, but who's to say it won't be other powers to fill it other than China and Russia? It doesn't mean that one of those powers is suddenly become a superpower. The unipolar era was very unique in the respect that there really was only one superpower. Most of the history of the world shows that there's multiple superpowers at one time. That's how I would push back
on this. Is like America. You had Aramati on the show. He called it
he called it the Death Star.
The Death Star.
And that was quite funny. There were so many people who were livid in the comments. And
Wait, he called the American Empire the Death Star?
The Death.
Okay.
It's called trigonometry for a reason. But my point being, right?
I'm with Aaron Mate, by the way, if it counts. I'm with him on that one.
Is what the choice you have actually in the real world is between an American-led world, or a Chinese-led world, or a Russian-led world.
That's not right.
And then I go, which of those would I rather live in?
Well, so I think, so I do agree, like generally speaking, right, that like something will fill a vacuum. But I don't think the choice is between an America-led world or a China-led world or a Russia-led world. I think what ends up filling those vacuums, like it's not inevitable that it's going to be a hegemon, that it's going to be one. In fact, the unipolar moment, which I think is kind of over at this point, but the unipolar moment is the aberration. That's like usually not the way the world has worked historically. Usually there are different competing powers and they have their spheres of influence. And then so in other words, yes, it might be true that there are areas where China fills the vacuum. But look, even which was kind of interesting, I think, to see over when Donald Trump first came in, right? When he was going, we're not going to fund the war in Ukraine anymore. Then you had European countries going like, okay, well, we're going to step up funding the war.
I totally agree with.
Right. So, but I'm just saying, so in a sense, the fact that America say, it didn't end up happening, but like, let's just say America withdrew in that instance. Well, there might be several other people who end up filling that vacuum. And you might, so like decentralization can also happen. It's not that a vacuum doesn't get filled, but it might get filled by multiple parties rather than one.
America's still involved in the war, though.
Right. No, I'm saying that didn't actually end up happening. I'm just saying,
that's
like,
because you
example,
didn't pull out.
Right, that's my point.
That you didn't pull out, though.
Exactly.
If you had pulled out, Ukraine would get overrun, and then you've got a whole new problem. And this is kind of, I think, where
that wouldn't be a problem to real Americans that don't care which regime rules the Donbass. It's just not. That might be your pet project to maintain, Kissen, but it's not ours. It's not people that are truly America only, don't want to send $200 billion down the drain while American families suffer here. That wouldn't be my problem. So don't say you'd have another problem. No, we wouldn't. We wouldn't if we actually abided by the non-interventionist foreign policy that basically kept America free and generally out of war for about a century under the Monroe Doctrine. That'd be a lot nicer. But I didn't anticipate Dave would answer this very similarly to what I did. He actually added a few other things I didn't think of, but I think his answer's right. It doesn't mean that there's a dichotomy of it's either China or it's either the United States, one of the two. And most likely it wouldn't be one of the two. It's very rare for there to be a unipolar moment. There wasn't even a unipolar moment at the height of, the Roman Empire, because you had the Han Dynasty in China as another superpower that very few people talk about at that time in history. But it was every bit as dominant as the Roman Empire during the time in which the Roman Empire reached its zenith in power.
There's a genuine disagreement about the ideas of this, because I come from a place where we don't have political correctness in Russia. So people don't pretend that all of this isn't true.
Right.
All of this stuff American people are told about, we're going out there to spread democracy, or they hate us because of our freedom. I mean, with Islamists, and we'll get onto that, that is partly true, but generally speaking,
that's not true. It's not even partially true that we're in Ukraine to spread democracy. The U.S. government overthrew the democracy in Ukraine in 2014 under Yanukovych and supports a madman that's suppressed political dissent, banned opposition parties, expands conscription, imposed martial law, shut down Russian media, shut down Eastern Orthodox churches. It's not even partially true, Konstantin.
It's about we want to control the land, we want to control the money, we want to control the oil, we want to control the rare earth minerals. Now, if we accept that, which I think we both agree on, then you go, well, do I want Americans being in charge of that? Or do I want the Chinese being in charge of that?
Again, though, I mean, I think it's like, it's not strictly like, I don't think, look, we are, even though, I mean, China's a big economy and has a lot of people, but we are substantially richer than China is, and we're going broke, being the world empire. I don't think China is looking at what we're doing and saying, you know what we should do? We should get in on these 20-year catastrophe forever wars and really have our society crumble while we waste all these resources. And so, like, I don't think it's going to be a global, like, hegemon unless it's the US right now. But that being said, I mean, I think empire is always a losing game. I mean, I think it's good for the ruling elite, but I think it always kind of ends up costing more to the nation than it ends up producing.
Always? Really?
Well, okay, maybe that's an overstatement. Maybe not in every single instance. In general, broadly speaking, I think that's the case. And I think Americans would be far better off if you say, whatever resources we get from fighting forever wars, I think we'd be far better off to not need to have an inflationary monetary policy, an income tax, a giant, like this giant burden. I think, like, if there is one lesson of America, it's that actually free markets and true capitalism is what's going to produce the most wealth in the most sustainable and ethical way.
Absolutely. And, the war machine's the biggest impediment to that. The welfare state that supports the richest and most politically connected lobbyists in big pharma, big tech, big regulatory industry, big bank, the military industrial complex, APEC, what have you. It's so foreign and alien to the concept of free trade and real productivity that we get. It seems like Konstantin is stuck back in this mercantilistic mindset where if you conquer enough of the territory on Earth, you're going to be prosperous because of that. But we know that whole thing's a sham. We know that trading makes prosperity. Argentina and Sweden were among the most prosperous countries about 100 years ago, and neither were major world empires. Even the United States did not become really a world empire until, after World War II. You did have some tendencies in that regard with the Spanish-American War and creating hegemony based on that in South America. But more or less, it doesn't have to be the case that prosperous countries are, naturally and, obligatorily a world empire. It's actually more of a rarity that a country happens to be a world empire. We're denigrating that through debt and inflation right now. But Constantine thinks that it seems to be that he thinks that that's the way to prosperity, dominating the world's resources through conquest and empire. But it's not. It's trade and productivity, as we know.
No, that I totally agree with. I'm not sure what you said about empires. I mean, we had one of the greatest historians. I'm not resorting to arguments from authority. I'm just saying.
You guys had Darryl Cooper on?
Dominic Sambrook, part of The Rest is History. I think they've got the biggest history podcast in the world. And he talked about the fact that empires are the natural unit of history. Like if you look throughout history, that tends to be the way that the great powers of the world operate. They're empires, right? So I don't know that it's fair to say that America's problems or any country's problems are about forever wars, because the entire Western world, including countries that weren't involved in the foreign wars, are all making the same mistake. And I think that mistake is not foreign policy, although as we discussed, there's been some pretty fucking big mistakes. It's about entitlements and benefits. And
that's true too. I mean, for sure. Yeah.
That's where I think actually we've basically got to a situation, and I can't remember whose quote it is, but we talked about this with one of our guests, where the public have worked out that they can vote to get more shit from the government and punish anyone electorally who says we can't give you more free shit.
Well, part of that entitlement structure is entitlements to the military-industrial complex, and in the form of foreign aid, which drives this whole madhouse to begin with. I'm with you if you want to abolish the welfare state. It seems like both parties will never do that because it's politically unfeasible. How would they maintain their voting constituencies if they did that? Republicans won't touch Medicare or Social Security in a serious way. And there's propaganda that they did that through the big, beautiful bill. It doesn't touch any of the benefits actually going out. There still is, something like, $2 trillion in overall welfare payments, regardless, no matter what. No one's going to cut back on that. But we're going to go into the tank because of that. It's unsustainable. Basically, the national debt grows $2 trillion a year. We spend way more than we have, and they print money to try to handle that and finance it. But that's a tax against all Americans, too. That's what drives inflation. But that is the military-industrial complex and military spending is part of the entitlement climate. It's the most unjustifiable part of the entitlement climate, in fact. When it comes to supporting welfare moms in the United States and supporting the Israeli regime, I don't like either, but I would much rather prioritize taking money from the corrupt, genocidal Israeli regime and at least spending it here if you're going to spend it. Now, I'm a radical libertarian. I wouldn't want to spend it that way, and I don't believe that necessarily even helps people on welfare. I think it creates a culture of dependency. And it doesn't lift people out of poverty to do that. Mutual aid would do that. That's what churches and charities did before the advent of the welfare state. And it would be much easier to do that in a climate where you're not taxed about 50% of your income. You'd have so much more money to do that. There's GoFundMe and all sorts of competitors to that available to provide funding to people in need. And how much more would Americans be willing to do that if they weren't taxed to such extremes? Americans are the most charitable people on earth, despite how much we're taxed, by the way.
And so in the UK, more people take more out of the benefit system than they put in, 51% of the public, right? And I think that's really the death spiral that we're in. We can't reduce our spending and we can't reduce our debt and we can't reduce our deficit because we don't want to forgo the free shit.
Yeah, well, I think that's right. And I think this is true on a lot of different levels, right? Certainly, I know a bit more about America than Europe, but look, I mean, the bottom line for all this is we have a government that's way bigger than what we can afford. Right? Just much, much bigger than what we can afford.
100%.
And so you can't tax enough to get there. So you have to tax your population, then you have to borrow a whole bunch of money, but even that's not enough. So then you got to print the money, right? And these are essentially the three ways government can raise money or can spend money. And so what you have now is that right, there are these giant entitlement programs that, yeah, it's much more politically advantageous for Donald Trump to say, I'll never cut Social Security or Medicare, because he's got to lock up that base of seniors who are Republicans. And also just the monetary system just keeps the prices of everything going up and up and up. And what it ends up creating in a weird way is a justification for socialism. I mean, you know, like when these kids say, they'll say things like profit is theft. And I think it's very easy for like guys like us to look at it and go, hey, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. Because the idea that what type of fixed pie fallacy is that?
Right.
That if I go out there and I'm successful, that doesn't mean I'm taking it from you. That means I'm creating more wealth. I'm creating a bigger pie with more slices. But the thing is that under this current paradigm, they do kind of have a point. Like I bought a house 3 years ago, just about exactly 3 years ago. And I just got, this isn't an official appraisal or anything like that, but I got a letter from my real estate agent that said the house is up 200 grand in the last 3 years. And that does seem, based on the listings I've seen the house is selling for, that seems about right. And you think about that in a way, you're like, wait, so what is that other than like essentially welfare from the system? That because I'm in the owner class, because I got into the owner class 3 years ago, I now get an extra 200 grand of my net worth. And the bar for young people to go buy a house is now that much higher. It's like I kind of did take that from them in a sense.
It's all because of the central bank and the Fed money printing sprees. You know, money printer go burr. That's what's happening here. And this is creating, you know, a twisted incentive structure that would not exist if not for central banking and the practices of the Fed. Politicians just love the Fed because they can get around taxing people without actually having to legislate the tax. They can get away with it politically much easier because there wouldn't be a bill in Congress to vote for more taxes. They just do that clandestinely due to this quasi-public-private banking cartel that they carved out in 1913.
But then, like, as we're starting to hit this point where the young generation is getting so left behind, you still have these entitlement programs that are transfers of wealth from the young people to the wealthier older people. I mean, think about how crazy that is.
And it's crazy, especially because there are fewer and fewer young people relative to the number of older people. But are you kind of, I think you're agreeing with me, which I appreciate, but isn't that kind of the point that while the foreign wars are bad and wrong and immoral in some cases, it's not really them that's causing all these problems.
Oh, I mean, it's a huge driver of it too. I mean, they're all, look, if you look at the American government, at this point, it's the entitlements, the defense budget, and the interest on the debt.
But the defense budget isn't about fighting all these foreign wars. The defense budget is about protecting your empire, which gives you access to, you basically control all of Europe, right? America dominates Europe. You basically decide what happens in Western Europe. You dominate parts of Asia. You get the resources that come with that. You get whatever oil you want from wherever you need it. You get to control the world.
That's not how it works. That's not how trade works through conquest. You're living in 1724. You're not living in 2025 where wealth is created through trade, not through conquest. Yeah, the United States government delves into those forays, but it really is, you know, the hardest way to acquire wealth, to spend, you know, millions and actually billions and actually trillions of dollars, as it did in the War on Terror, about $8 trillion spent on that to extract resources from Iraq. The oil that the United States got from contracts close to, you know, Halliburton and the Bush administrations are just, you know, paltry compared to what's possible via worldwide trade, where you don't take the broken window fallacy, the idea that, you know, breaking things is good for the economy en masse, which is what war is. That's not how you acquire it. So I don't think Kissinger's really living in reality in a global economy. He's thinking that conquest is the key to economic prosperity here. I just don't see any way out of this.
You have a defense budget not because you want to invade Iraq. You have a defense budget because you're the biggest country. I know you don't like hearing this, but in the absence of a neutral world policeman, America, someone's going to be the world policeman. Someone's going to be going around kicking ass.
A neutral world policeman is America, this crooked regime, obsessed with regime change operations against countries, some of which used to be U.S. allies. Like Afghanistan, you had the Mujahideen pumping in arms to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets in the 80s. You had the U.S. pumping in arms to Iraq in the Iraq-Iran war? Will the United States overthrow both of those countries? How is this even remotely justifiable? It's not a neutral world police. It's an empire-building scheme.
Right. And if you want to have the 25% of the world's resources, that's you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't mind hearing it. I think that is the way things are. But it's illegal under our Constitution. The American people never decided that they want this. And in fact, the American people are saying pretty loudly, we don't want this anymore. We don't want to pour money into all these different parts of the world. And I don't agree with you that we get more bang for our buck than we otherwise would.
Absolutely. Can't agree with Dave more. He actually took a different route of argumentation than I would against some of this stuff. But, it's very persuasive. Americans have had it they've had enough of this. They've had enough of empire building and hegemony and the idea that we can just go overseas, extract resources, police the world, and that's just fine. There'll never be domestic ramifications. More and more people see that there are. And even without that, it's just striking the hypocrisy when you make your mantra America first, but that seems to be the priority. That foreign policy seems to be the priority over domestic policy. Even if you're not keenly aware of foreign policy or can care about it that much, that does seem like a striking disconnect between the political class in the United States and Americans. So yeah, we can go down with the ship, or we can get out of this mess by stopping the empire building schemes, stopping the welfare entitlements, which are closely intertwined, regardless of what Konstantin Kisin wants to say, that, these can be put into separate buckets. I don't think so. I think it's the same bucket that, drives the war machine. It's propaganda, too, that drives it. And my good friend Daniel McAdams always says that war propaganda is lubing the engine of the war machine. War propaganda greases the wheels of the war machine, in fact, and that's what we get from these schemes. But what did you think? Do you think Dave or Konstantin was more persuasive? Who's more correct on this? Let me know in the comments down below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Trigonometry. Like it or not, I appreciated this interview. Reasonable conversation, definitely a lot of difference of opinion, but I thank those guys for having Dave on. If you like this video, please consider becoming a YouTube member. You can do that by clicking the join button below. You can support the channel that way, and in return, I'll give you access to all of my videos before they go live to the general public. Those are the members only videos. You'll be able to watch those right away if you join as a member. Also, if you want a free copy of my first book, Compact of the Republic, click the link below, go to that website, plug in your email, I'll send it to you free of charge, no obligation, just because I appreciate you as a viewer. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.